During our evening Wednesday prayer services for families, we've been working through the book of Genesis, and so far we've shared the story of creation, the story of Adam and Eve, and of Cain and Abel. And this week, when we celebrate St. Francis Day with the blessing of the animals, we'll share the story of Noah's Ark. As good liberal Christians, it's easy for most of us to employ our imaginations when we read these stories from Genesis. We understand that we can love these stories and respect them, and at the same time accept that the world likely was not created in 7 days, that Adam and Eve were not real people, that Noah did not actually herd all of the animals by twos into the ark. When it comes to stories like these, we tend to embrace their mythological nature. And then we get to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, where the stories and the lists of communal expectations and outdated laws are met with an eye roll. It is as if our imaginations have left the building. We can no longer see the myth, the mystery, the majesty. Just lists that seem so totally irrelevant and at times so totally inappropriate. I would imagine I am not the only one of us who has eagerly set out to read the Bible in one fell swoop from start to finish. I'm merrily on my way, and then I get to Leviticus, and that plan suddenly seems like the worst idea ever. And I don't think I have ever made it through that entire book. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male or female slave or ox or donkey. I am pretty sure I don't and won't be coveting any of those things. So why again does this matter to me? Modern Christianity has pulled the Ten Commandments from their context, so much so that they themselves, standing alone, have become a sort of cultural icon. But these commandments ask to be read in the context of the surrounding story, in the context of an ancient people's desert journey. Have you ever paid attention to this kind of awe-inspiring magical framework around the Ten Commandments? Listen with me. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, as well as a thick cloud on the mountain, and a blast of a trumpet so loud that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln, while the whole mountain shook violently. As the blast of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses would speak and God would answer him in thunder. The people stood at a distance while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. Then God spoke all these words. The Decalogue is embedded within a mythical origin story, with smoke, lights, and trumpets, the whole shebang. When we read the Ten Commandments solely as history, they quickly become a 2,000-year-old list of seemingly irrelevant thou shalt nots, which catches us in the weeds with questions like, how in the world did they come up with these particular 10 things? If instead we read the Decalogue in light of its surrounding myth, a timeless truth shows through. We know this. The role of origin stories in the Bible is not to recount scientific historic events or outline laws meant to be followed exactly as they were written, but to tell us about the nature of God and about our relationship with God. Over the years, origin stories morph into some kind of colorful amalgam of truth and myth, nostalgia and cautionary tale. The contours and shades of their significance brought out by the particular light of a particular moment. So as I've asked our children and families on Wednesday nights, I wonder, what does this story tell us about God and about ourselves? First and foremost, that God's authority derives from God's liberation of the Israelites from bondage. That the authority God proclaims is directly tied to the people of Israel, whom God led out of slavery. This divine self-revelation is so particular, and it suggests that we can't make any assertions about who God is apart from the action of God, apart from these words, freedom from slavery. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. The thou shalt nots of the Decalogue were not delivered in a vacuum. They were delivered in the wilderness between Egypt and the Promised Land. They were delivered on Mount Sinai as an extension of God's liberation of the Hebrew slaves, the continuation of their deliverance story. Biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann observed, "The commandments of Sinai are always grounded in the surprise of liberation from Egypt." If one does not believe in the surprise of liberation, then the endless multiplications of commandments from Sinai is silly. For more commandments without the foundation of the Exodus story will never create a community of well-being. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. God calls us to fidelity because God herself seeks commitment and covenant with her people. Not unlike a marriage covenant, a metaphor which is invoked throughout both the Old and the New Testaments, this devotion is a two-way street. And the laws of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and so on set the expectations for this marriage with God and devotion to community. Within the Israelite community, a devoted relationship with God is inseparable from a devoted relationship with one another. This is reflected in a communal honoring of the Sabbath, respect for elders, and love for and honesty with neighbors. You see, the Decalogue, which begins with I am Yahweh your God, ends with the words your neighbor. And so we see that communal life according to the commandments is fundamentally about a radical commitment to God and radical compassion for one another. So we have a God who liberates and commits, and a people who honor that commitment with devotion, love, and trust. The Israelites are beginning to move out of the wilderness when this story is told. They are in the process of recreating themselves, rebranding themselves, you could say. And with the guidance of God, they set the framework for their community. A radical community at that, which is bound not by common goals of wealth and prestige, but rather by loyalty to a God who is liberator and redeemer. From its beginning to its end, the Decalogue deals with the redemption of an oppressed community from both external and internal forces. As fellow Episcopalian Rachel Held Evans wrote, "We don't tend to think of law as liberating, but for the people of Israel, these instructions led to freedom. They helped forge a unique national identity, one wholly distinct from the cultures around them, most importantly, from the Egyptian empire that for so long oppressed them. This is a God who cares about every detail of their new life together, right down to the management of their oxen. This is a God for whom deliverance is not a one-time deal." The Bible's original audience may not share our culture, but they certainly share our humanity. And the God they worshiped invited them to see that humanity to its fullest potential. This is what sets us apart as Christians. The imagination of, the devotion to, and the hope for a sacred story, a different story, a fuller potential. The belief in a God who restores the brokenhearted, feeds the poor, clothes the righteous, and topples the powerful. The hope for a promised land, for a community, for a nation that trusts this God, that heeds her demands. God knows this promised land feels distant and improbable right now. Amidst failures in national leadership, rising death tolls, increasing gaps in wealth, where do I start? Where do I end? I can also tell you that the promised land felt distant and improbable to the wandering Israelites over 2,000 years ago, thirsty, hungry, in the middle of nowhere desert. But it is in this wilderness where they met God, where they girded up their loins and formed their community. It is in this wilderness where Moses walked into the thick darkness to hear God's voice in the storm, out of the whirlwind, through the chaos. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So believe in the improbable, seek justice in the darkness, write stories full of wonder and hope, even when, especially when you can't find it so easily. And as the Lord commanded atop a different mountain at a different time, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Amen.